This is the story of Miami Air International Flight 293. On the 3rd of May 2019, a Miami Air International 737 was on its way from Guantanamo Naval Air Station to Jacksonville Naval Air Station. This was the second flight of the day, and it was their last. Before leaving, the pilots checked the weather for their destination. It was quite stormy, so they decided to also check the weather for their alternate airport. The weather wasn't the only thing that concerned them. The left-hand thrust reverser was out of commission for this flight. The thrust reverser is pretty important as it redirects engine thrust, allowing the plane to slow down while landing. It's a nice to have, but not a must, so they decided to go ahead with the flight. The takeoff from Guantanamo and the cruise were all normal, and once they started to near Jacksonville, they started to pick up some weather on their radar. The pilots decided to fly around storm cells, avoiding the worst of it. At this time, Jacksonville Naval Air Station was getting absolutely hammered with rain. The winds were at 20 knots and gusting up to 30 knots. In the cockpit, the pilots were setting the plane up for an Rnav approach to runway 10 at Jacksonville. The pilots set the autobreak to 2 in anticipation of the runway being wet. But the controller then decided to change things up. The controller cleared flight 293 for an Rnav approach to runway 28. The controller told the pilots to expect moderate to heavy rains on their approach to runway 28. As the controller took flight 293 lower and lower, the pilots programmed the Rnav 28 approach into the flight management computer of the 737. As they flew the approach, the controller could see that the rain was moving to the east, so they inquired with flight 293 about landing on runway 10 instead. The captain thought that this was a good idea and said, "Yeah, go ahead, let's do it." The controller guided flight 293 to the final approach fix for runway 10. The controller let flight 293 know that he'd be using precision approach radar monitoring to help the pilots get down to the runway. PAR, or precision approach radar, is often used by the US Navy in poor visibility conditions to help pilots line up with the runway. As the plane got closer, the controller gave the pilots rollout and go-around data for the approach. As the gear came out, the winds at the runway was at 240 degrees and 10 knots. At 9:40 p.m., the controller let the pilots know that they were well above the 3-degree glide path down to the runway. Within seconds, the autopilot was disconnected and the rate of descent went up from 1,100 to 1,400 feet per minute. The pilots worked through the landing checklist. As the landing checklist was completed, the rate of descent had slowed to about 1,000 feet per minute. The 737 was pretty much on glide now, but it didn't stay that way for long. The 747 was once again above the glide slope within minutes. Moreover, the pilots were struggling to keep the plane lined up with the runway. When they were at 1,400 feet, the plane was 100 feet to the right of the runway. That margin just grew for a while till they were 220 feet to the right of the runway. As the plane descended, the pilots put the plane into a left bank to correct that. In the cockpit, sync rate warnings blared as the plane got closer and closer to the runway. They were descending way too fast, and they were just too fast, period. Flight 293 touched down 1,500 feet past the displaced threshold of runway 10. As soon as they were on the runway, the pilots engaged the reverse thrust on the right-hand engine, and the spoilers came out, slowing the plane down. As the plane went down the runway, the auto brakes kicked in, and soon after that, the pilots started braking manually. The captain was braking as hard as he could, but the plane just wasn't slowing down. He was fighting to keep his plane on the center line. But despite all of this, the plane still wasn't slowing down fast enough. The problem was, unlike most airports, runway 10 at Jacksonville led right to a river. So, if they weren't able to stop this plane in time, then they would be in the drink. Soon, flight 293 had run out of runway, and it overran the runway. The plane went right through a seawall, and it fell into the river. Thankfully, the water was shallow, and the captain immediately called for an evacuation. None of the 143 people on board were injured. The runway at Jacksonville was 8,000 feet long. For the 747, that was more than enough for a safe landing. Looking at the data for the landing, they saw that the plane's speed for the landing was 17 knots above the target approach speed, and that the speed brakes were deployed a bit late. This was because the pilots didn't arm the speed brakes in their landing checklist. Had they done so, then the speed brakes would have deployed a lot sooner. All this contributed to the severity of the crash, but those reasons weren't the root cause. Calculations showed that even if the pilots had flown a perfect approach, the 737 would not have been able to stop on the runway. This was due to all the water that was on the runway. The runway was ungrooved, and so the water just pooled on the runway. This caused a phenomenon known as hydroplaning. In short, hydroplaning is when you have a buildup of water pressure under the tire. This meant that braking action was greatly reduced, and the plane would need a lot more distance to actually stop. Calculations showed that the braking coefficient for the flooded runway was significantly lesser than the values assumed for a wet runway in the flight crew operations manual and by the onboard computers. In very simple terms, this runway was a lot more slippery than anyone had expected. The investigators noted that the flight crew had not done a landing distance assessment. They were not required to do that if the braking on the runway was reported to be good or better, but they had not been given any information about the braking action on the runway. Therefore, they should have calculated the required landing distance for runway 10. But the weird thing is, even if they had calculated the landing distance for the runway, it would have told them that they had more than enough runway to land. If the runway was so wet, why did they attempt the landing in the first place? Hydroplaning is not some obscure phenomenon. Pilots and controllers all know that it's a possibility when landing on a wet, contaminated runway. So, that begs the question, why did the pilots go ahead with the landing in the first place? Safety alert for operators, which is kind of like a bulletin for air operators, number 15009 stated that pilots needed to assume runway conditions of medium or fair when landing on a wet runway where the braking conditions are not known. This particular guidance was not in the operator standard operating procedures. Had it been there, it would have forced the pilots to assume that the braking action on the runway was worse than good when computing their landing performance data, and they would have known that the landing was unsafe. But unfortunately, like I mentioned before, that bit of information was not in the standard operating procedures, so they went ahead with the landing. Here's the thing, this plane would have gone off the runway even if the pilots had flown a textbook approach with zero mistakes. The data showed that Flight 293 was unstable from the get-go of this approach. They were not on glide, they were too fast, and for a bit they weren't even lined up with the runway. They should have gone around, but yet they went ahead with the approach. Why? The first officer only had spent 18 hours on the 737, and most of his experience was on light aircraft, so he wasn't monitoring the approach as well as he should have been. Had he done that, then he might have called for a go-around. That still doesn't explain why the captain decided to land. The captain was very experienced, so why didn't he just go around? Well, the captain may have fallen victim to continuation bias. Continuation bias is this unconscious desire to continue with the plans that you've already made, despite the things around those plans changing. In this case, the captain had decided to land. The weather and the way the plane was being flown should have made him reconsider, but he did not do that. On top of that, the captain may have been facing a time crunch. The flight was already delayed due to a maintenance issue, and a go-around or a diversion would just have added more delays to an already delayed flight. That's just not what the captain wanted, so he decided to go for it, with disastrous consequences. In addition to all of that, the CVR revealed that the captain's workload during the landing was huge. He was flying the plane, making radio calls, and then he was being the check pilot all by himself. All of this in a rapidly deteriorating weather environment. This meant that it was the perfect situation for mistakes to creep in, and unfortunately for all on board, those mistakes did creep in. I would just like to add that it was perfectly fine to fly the plane with one thrust reverser disabled. That in no way played a part in this accident. Planes have lists called MELs, or a minimum equipment list. It's basically a list of items that can be inoperative on an aircraft. One of the thrust reversers is on the MEL, so it's perfectly safe to fly with one of the thrust reversers disabled. Another plane that flew with a disabled thrust reverser was TAM 3054. You can watch my video on TAM 3054 on your screen right now. Did you know that hydroplaning was a thing on airplanes? Let me know in the comments below. What do you think is the main cause for this accident? The captain continuing on with the approach, or the operator for not having adequate measures in place to recognize the dangers posed by wet runways? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.